Kevin Welman from Fleishman Hillard, a very warm welcome to you. So, crisis management. Let me ask you first of all, the advent or the acceleration of social media, has it made crisis management more difficult to contain?
No, I don't think it has, Jeremy. I think it certainly made crisis management more interesting. That's for sure. You've got more outlets to communicate messages. You've got more people to tell. What I think social media has done, it's brought believers into the system. So if you have a brand and you've built your social channels over time, in the good times, because that's when social channels should be built, you can communicate to your communities very quickly and very easily and bring them on board. And a well-run community, if you look at, say, the Apple community, for instance, a lot of their issues are put out by their community, not even by their corporate comms team or by the company themselves. So no, I think it's more exciting.
But on the flip side, anybody who's dealing with a crisis is having to cope with this avalanche of information that is coming your way from every single quarter. That surely has made your job a whole lot more difficult.
Yes, it's made it more intense. Yes, it's sped things up. I always say the advent of social media has essentially taken crises and put them on steroids. They just sped up. It's taken hours and converted them into seconds. But if your systems are built up, if you've got plans in place, if you know who has certain responsibilities through a crisis, you can navigate it pretty well.
Systems and plans. Let's talk about that. The speed of this movement of information, I would imagine, has necessitated more rapid crisis management planning. So, where do you start? How do you develop that plan?
I think if you start, we say in the agency that if your crisis communication plan is more than 6 months old, it's almost irrelevant. That's how quickly things are moving. If you think back sort of 3 years, which is 36 months, social media just didn't have the influence it has today. If you go back even 3 months, it doesn't. So you put plans in place, you put systems in place, you build a team around your brand. You might have a well-established Facebook profile, you might have a well-established Twitter handle, etc. You might have hundreds of thousands of people following you across these social platforms. Empower your people to communicate across those channels. So yes, build those plans, know who's responsible, know how to communicate, and know what your message is, and then use all the channels available to you to mitigate a crisis.
I'm interested to use the phrase empower your people, yes, which says that more than one person is communicating within a crisis. There's the old model, that plan that you've just referred to, that dusty old one in the bottom drawer that should be dusted off. It used to be one person. It was all channels came from one person. That's changed, has it?
Without question, in my mind. I mean, a team can be one person, depending on the size of the brand, depending on the severity of the crisis. But if you look at Marikana, I mean, there must have been multiple people in place. If you look at the presidency, there must be multiple people in place. For me, a crisis team has a couple of very distinct roles. There should be a scribe, someone writing. There should be someone directing the crisis. There should be someone looking after logistics. Maybe it's press conferences. Maybe it's media outreach. There should be somebody dealing with the board or internal communications, for instance. There should be somebody dealing with social media. So your team could be one person. It could be 15 people.
Is it the chief executive ultimately where all of this sits at?
I do believe firmly a chief executive, you are in charge of the company, you are the go-to guy, you should be taking responsibility.
So often they abrogate that responsibility, don't they?
So often a call is made for somebody else to lead a crisis, sometimes right, sometimes wrong. But I do believe a CEO should be taking responsibility in a crisis situation.
And directing the operations? Not
directing the operations necessarily. A chief executive's job is to manage the reputation of that company, of the brand, and to manage the company ultimately. You should have a corporate communications person in place, a crisis mitigator, you could have a PR agency, you could have a consultant of some kind. I don't believe your spokesperson should be managing the crisis, because those are two very different roles in my opinion. So it really depends on the makeup of the crisis at that moment.
All right, Kevin Welman, you knee deep in this crisis. You have social media that's playing a huge role in this avalanche of information that I spoke about. How does the company then deal with this deluge of rumour, of conjecture, of innuendo that keeps coming down the social media pipeline?
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. I think there's the period of time before a crisis hits, and I'd like to define a crisis just very quickly.
Good point, yeah.
A crisis for me is an unexpected event that can damage your reputation. Unexpected. So something like labour relations or strikes or wage negotiations, that for me is not a crisis. That is an issue. You know it's
That's
on the
part
horizon.
of your risk mitigation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's an issue. You know it's on the horizon. You know what has to be done, and you should have a plan in place. A crisis for me is unexpected. There's a period of time before a crisis hits where you are building your communications channels, where you're building your community around your brand. You should be keeping people informed. You should be communicating with them well. If that is in place and that operation is reasonably slick, moving into a crisis is a lot easier because the channels are already in place. And then you can move through a crisis much more easily.
Okay, so you're knee-deep in that crisis, but the challenge during any crisis management process is to be able to change strategy and direction, because within the crisis, things are changing all the time. That's often where the brand gets it wrong.
I think with systems and processes, again, I've used your phrase from earlier, the analytics that you can put behind a crisis, with social media monitoring, where you're able to pull out sentiment behind a brand literally by the minute, if not by the half hour or by the hour. You're able to look and feel what people are thinking and feeling about your brand, again, by the half hour, if necessary. It's quite easy with the analytical tools available in the social space to direct your crisis a lot more easily. You're able to bring words into your statements. You're able to answer frequently asked questions more effectively. I think in the old days, the only way you got customer feedback was through your call center. Now you've got customer feedback the whole time. Harness it and use it to your advantage.
Very quickly, and a final question to you. How do you know when it's over?
It's never over. Sometimes an issue, it goes onto the back foot, but again, it's for me a communications process. It's not a sort of absolute peak and value, go from nothing and then back to nothing. It's a constant. There should be a hump in it around the crisis, but for me a process is never over.
Kevin Welman from Fleishman Hillard, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.